So, what is physiology? Well, it's just the study of how the body works. Because every second, your body is making thousands of adjustments to keep you alive, often without you being aware of them. If you stand up quickly, if you exercise, skip a meal, or walk outside on a cold day, your physiology responds immediately. So, throughout this session, we're going to focus on the mechanisms behind these responses rather than you just simply memorizing facts. Because understanding normal physiology rather than just remembering it is essential because you can't recognize abnormal function until you understand what normal looks like. So, what is physiology? Well, like we said, it's the study of the functions and mechanisms in a living organisms. Because physiologists often ask how questions rather than what questions. Instead of asking what the heart is, we ask how does it generate pressure and maintain blood flow? And physiological processes can occur across many, many different levels, from the molecular interactions inside cells, where how cells are exchanging energy, signals, and substances, to the systems physiology, where we're communicating between entire organ systems. So, although we often study organisms or systems separately, the body does not work in isolated components or compartments. The challenge of physiology is linking small-scale cellular components, what's happening in the cell, to what's happening at a more tissue level, to then into an organ level, and then throughout an entire organism level. And homeostasis is basically our physiological systems working together to maintain stable internal conditions despite external changes that may be occurring. So, like we said, homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable internal environment, and it must be maintained for normal body functioning and to sustain life, because the body is constantly changing both internally and externally. Yet most of the physiological variables remain within surprisingly low levels. So homeostasis doesn't mean keeping things absolutely constant. It means maintaining variables within a range that is acceptable for the body. And these variables are critical because cells only function properly under specific conditions. So what I would like you to think about, what are some of the variables that the body actually regulates? What do you think they are? Just press pause, have a little bit of a think. I'll give you one to give you a clue, okay? Blood glucose levels. The body is continuously keeping our blood glucose levels at a nice level through the actions of insulin, was one hormone, and glucagon, amongst other hormones, to regulate that blood glucose. What are some of the other variables the body regulates? So hopefully you've had a good little think and you've come up with a wide variety. And this is just a little snapshot. So we talked about blood glucose being regulated. Your body temperature is regulated nicely at 37 degrees. Your blood pressure is nicely regulated. So is your water balance. And that's just talking about your blood volume. And your blood volume actually influences that blood pressure as well. Your blood pH, you don't want to be too acidic and you don't want to be too alkalotic. Your cells work in this nice little pH range. It's about 7.35 to 7.45, just for your information. And of course, we need to regulate our blood oxygen and our carbon dioxide levels as well. So much of physiology really can be viewed as the study of how the body maintains these homeostatic variables. And a key point about homeostasis and about control of homeostasis is that it's integrated. Our different body systems are working together. So here we've just got a nice little, it's a small diagram. It looks a bit complicated, but it's not. I just want you to think about how the body is working together. You're eating a meal, okay? So your digestive system, you're taking in some nutrients. So your stomach, your esophagus, your mouth, your small intestine, your large intestine, all the different tissues of the GI tract are working together to absorb nutrients into the blood. And so your cardiovascular system pumps those nutrients around the body. Of course, we need to have the oxygen coming in to be able to use those nutrients, and we need the CO2 to be going out. So our respiratory system is involved. And of course, those products that you've taken in through your GI tract, they get used and you start to generate waste products. And we need to get rid of those through our renal system and out through the urine. So you can see how physiology is tightly integrated and regulated. And a change in one variable can therefore involve many body systems reacting to that change. So what I would like you to do right now is think about what happens to the body, to the physiological systems when your body temperature begins to fall. Because this example highlights that the body's response to a challenge is rarely confined to a single organ. Temperature regulation requires coordinated responses from your nervous system, your cardiovascular system, your endocrine system, that's your hormones, your respiratory systems, your lungs, and your musculoskeletal system. And these different systems contribute in different ways, but all share the same goal, to restore, in this case, your core temperature. So I'd like you to think, what are each of those body systems or those organs actually doing to help to maintain your core body temperature? So again, press pause, have a think. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. So cardiovascular system, what's happening there? So your vasculature, your blood vessels, to most organs, they will start to what's called vasoconstrict. So they will constrict and less blood will go to those tissues. So if you've got a drop in your body temperature, where do you need it being retained? You need it being retained within your core. So the blood is needed to go to keep you nice and warm. So you don't want it going out to your skin. So you'll get vasoconstriction, in particular to your skin, and that can lead to numbness in the extremities as that blood flow is restricted. And that numbness can be a sign of potential frostbite if it becomes a little bit more significant. You've got skeletal muscles, so they start to contract, and you will know that as shivering. You start to shiver, and that is generating heat to try and warm you up. You've also got in the skin, you've got muscles that are contracting there, smooth muscles that contract and cause your hairs to stand up on end. And as they stand up on end, they grab hold of, or they kind of trap air amongst them, and that air starts to warm up and helps to keep your skin a little bit warmer. You've got the endocrine system, so that's your hormones. So thyroxine, that is the main hormone involved in regulating your metabolic rate. So you increase your metabolic rate, which makes you feel warmer because it's producing heat. And a lot of the effects of feeling cold are mediated through what's called adrenaline, which is another hormone, which is the main fight or flight hormone. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. You've got your respiratory system. What happens there? Your respiratory rate may increase slightly to try and increase heat production through skeletal muscle contractions and delivery of oxygen to nutrients. But it also, cold also, interestingly, triggers mucus production. Think about it. When you get cold, it's a cold day, you go outside, you start to get a runny nose. So you do get that increase in mucus production. And then thinking about your heart as well. Of course, cold exposure increases the heart rate and blood pressure as the body attempts to maintain circulation and blood flow to those vital organs. So your brain, your heart, and your lungs. And finally, your nervous system. So you've got different aspects of your nervous system. You've got the nervous system that is driving the release of adrenaline because that's released from a modified part of your sympathetic nervous system. But also you've got the motivation to put on a jumper, go jogging on the spot to create heat, move out of the cold, leave the fridge, go into the warmth. Or you might want to curl up to decrease surface area. So there are lots of motivational things that are involved as well. So most of our physiological regulation patterns follow a common organization, regardless of what the variable being controlled is. They usually have a sensor, which is gathering the information. So here we've got a change. So here's our balance. If you want to think of it sitting on a pyramid, you've got we're in homeostasis when it's level. And if you get an imbalance, you get a stimulus, you get a change. That is detected by a receptor or a sensor. So they're the things that are gathering the information. That information is sent to a control center. That control center interprets that information and passes or relays the information out to an efferent pathway to what's called an effector, which mediates the response and tries to bring it back to normal. We kind of talked about that one example already. You got a bit cold, that is detected by a receptor. That goes to your control sensor, and then you have multiple responses coming out through your effector. So remember, you've got the shivering, your heart rate going up, your motivation to put on a jumper. You've got lots of effectors being controlled or regulated by the control center. So most of our homeostatic systems operate via what's called negative feedback. So negative feedback doesn't prevent change from occurring, but it responds after a change has been detected. And its main role is to minimize disturbances and return the variable back to where we want it to be, back to the body's normal range. So therefore, because it's promoting stability, so it's promoting that steady state, negative feedback is the most common regulatory strategy in physiology. And nearly every major homeostatic variable relies heavily on negative feedback. So here's a little example for you. So I want you all now, you're at home, sitting there watching this, hold your breath and hold your breath for as long as you can. As you are holding your breath, your carbon dioxide levels are starting to rise. They're getting higher and higher. That CO2 rise, which is kind of, I want you to think about it as an acid, because CO2 acts like an acid. It is meaning that your pH is dropping. You're becoming more acidic. That is being detected by a variety of receptors throughout the body, and they are then going to respond. They are then detecting it. It goes to our control centers. That's in a place called our brain stem, which sits between our spinal cord and our brain. That's our control center. And that control center is saying, hey, I've really got to breathe now. I've got to blow out this carbon dioxide. So you exhale. Your CO2 returns to normal and you get a bit more. And as you breathe in, your oxygen levels go up and you come back. That's your negative feedback. You then hold your breath again, and the whole process happens. And actually, I said hold your breath, but actually just breathing in and out, as we are doing all of the time, is changing those CO2 levels ever so slightly, causing this feedback loop to always maintain a beautiful level of carbon dioxide in our blood, and therefore a beautiful amount of oxygen in our blood as well. So that is our negative feedback. But we do also have positive feedback loops, much less common because positive feedback loops are actually driving change. They're targeting an endpoint. Okay, so they are self-amplifying and rapid. And unlike negative feedback, these positive feedback loop systems require a clear endpoint, like I've already said, to stop the cycle. So we've got a couple of obvious ones. You've got rapid change in the body, for example, during childbirth. So during childbirth, as the baby grows, it starts to press on what are called stretch receptors in the uterus. These are your sensors. So they are being activated, goes to the brain. The brain detects that signal and goes, oh, we need to do something about this. We need to get the baby is getting bigger. It needs to maybe be removed. We need to give birth. So it causes the release of oxytocin. That's a hormone that acts on the muscles in the uterus and they start to contract. And as they contract, they cause greater pressure on these stretch receptors, which means more oxytocin, which means more muscle contractions, more stretch receptor activation, and the cycle continues all the way until eventually the contractions get stronger and stronger until the baby is finally delivered. And then when the baby is delivered, of course, there is no more pressure on these stretch receptors, so the signal starts to decrease. Okay, so that's your endpoint. So you've got that clear endpoint. And without that endpoint, of course, amplification could become harmful. So another classic example, I use this example because this is one that's always used in physiology all of the time. But another good example is blood clotting. So if you get an injury to your blood vessels, you get a nice clot forming. That again is a positive feedback mechanism to cause a blood clot. But eventually you will clot that blood vessel. You don't want clotting to keep going. So the negative feedback means that it doesn't keep going and going and going because you've reached the endpoint that you need, and then it can come back to control. So another key thing I want you to think about is how organ systems actually cooperate to do the same thing. So for example, vitamin D production and calcium absorption. Now, that might seem a little bit simple, but vitamin D production needs 3 organ systems to cooperate with each other. To make vitamin D, which is made from cholesterol, just so you know, the skin is absorbing UV light and it activates that cholesterol. Okay, so it does the first step in the pathway. The second step, the liver then further activates that vitamin D, that immature vitamin D. And then finally, the kidneys produce the very active form of vitamin D, the vitamin D that actually does the job. So you can see you've got 3 systems. You need enough UV light coming into the skin. You need the liver to be then activating it to the next step, and the kidneys to finally produce the active vitamin D. And the active vitamin D works on the gut to absorb calcium. So actually, to absorb calcium, you need four organs to be working. You need the skin to be working, the liver to be working, the kidneys to be working, and the GI tract to be working. So failure of any one part of this pathway can affect calcium balance and therefore normal physiological function. So it just reminds us that physiology is fundamentally about communication and cooperation between our body systems. So finally, we're going to have a little bit of a scenario for you to think about. How does the body attempt to restore homeostasis if something goes a little bit wrong? So this is kind of introducing pathophysiology to you. So what physiological responses will occur, for example, if your blood volume starts to fall? So if you have fairly significant bleed, what are the consequences? So here are the things I want you to think about: blood pressure, what happens to your blood vessels, your heart rate, your breathing rate, and your urine output. So what is the consequence if you start to use or lose reasonably high levels of blood from an injury, for example? So your blood volume is dropping. Okay, so I'd like you to press pause and have a think about what's happening in each case. Okay, so what do we think is happening to our blood pressure? Well, if you are losing blood volume, you've got less volume in your blood, so your blood pressure begins to drop, and you might start to feel a little bit lightheaded as less blood is going to your head and therefore your brain. Blood vessels, well, you want to maintain the right amount of blood going to your essential organs. If you're losing blood, your gut doesn't matter, your kidneys don't matter, your reproductive system doesn't matter, your skin doesn't matter. What matters is your heart, your brain, and your lungs. They're the ones that are keeping you alive. So you get what's called vasoconstriction to your skin, which will give you pale skin, vasoconstriction to your gut and to your kidneys. And that means more blood is available for your heart, your lungs, and your brain. Heart rate, what happens there? Well, your blood volume has dropped, so therefore your heart has to pump faster to get enough blood going to those essential organs. So you might get a faster pulse, but because there's less blood volume, it might be quite weak. There's not enough blood there, so it's pumping smaller amounts, but it's having to pump faster. What about breathing? Well, it's the same problem, isn't it? You're not getting enough blood going through your lungs, so therefore your breathing rate may need to increase to drive more oxygen into the smaller amount of blood that is there. So you might end up hyperventilating. And finally, urine output. Well, urine production is fairly non-essential. Urine is made by the kidneys. We're not getting as much blood going to our kidneys. And what blood is going to our kidneys, we are trying to retain as much of that fluid as possible. So your urine output falls, and you may get what's called oliguria, so much smaller amounts of urine being produced. So this scenario really illustrates how homeostatic mechanisms become activated when the body faces a significant challenge. It's important to notice that many responses are designed to preserve blood flow to organs that are most critical for survival, like I said, particularly the brain, the heart, and the lungs. No single response solves the problem. Multiple systems are working together simultaneously. And really, the body's ability to compensate is really impressive. But these mechanisms are not unlimited, and eventually they'll have their limits. So finally, what are the key things we want to take away from this? Well, physiology seeks to explain how the body functions and works rather than just describing its structure. Homeostasis provides a really useful framework for understanding much of human physiology. And what is really key is that our organ systems are interconnected and are communicating. And the examples that we've talked about today are simple demonstrations of the principles that will reappear throughout physiology and organ function in the various resources that I'm going to provide over the coming days, weeks, and longer. Thank you very much.